DJ and PK, it's 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. Jazz tickets coming up, bottom of the hour. Stay tuned. We'll give them away to see the game Saturday with the Hornets. They're coming back home after they play Oklahoma City on Wednesday. David Locke's least favorite NBA road trip. Get to hear him complain about that on Friday.
I like that place.
He got a shot in at him at last week.
I like the convenience of the airport and all the smaller places and get in and out. I've been there multiple times for work.
I was there one time. It was for 6 hours at the end of a trip and just straight into the hotel, go to sleep, get up, and go to the airport. Got no experience there. Yeah. DJ PK, and we're joined now by Austin Meek, Michigan writer for The Athletic. Austin, good morning.
Hey, guys. How are you doing?
We are doing well this morning. How is the University of Michigan football fan doing with all the changes and Kyle Whittingham showing up and hiring a staff? How's it going?
I think Michigan fans are feeling a lot better today than they were feeling a couple weeks ago, I can tell you that. This has been a traumatic month, I think, for a lot of Michigan fans, what the program has been through. Initially, it was a lot of shock and embarrassment as this scandal unfolded with Sharon Moore. Michigan fans were looking for somebody to restore some integrity, I think, to the program. Michigan fans were looking for a reason to be proud of their program again. I think a lot of them feel like Kyle Whittingham is the right person to restore that sense of pride in the program. So I think a lot of Michigan fans are really optimistic about where things are going with the new coach.
Yeah, I'm an old newspaper guy. I have 23 years of daily experience, and so I still write a piece here for one of the local websites. And I wrote that they got Mr. Clean because, he has avoided a lot of distractions, and he's a very simple guy in his family life and so forth, and doesn't have any really big-time things, no vices, essentially, unless he's fooling the rest of us. But with all that in mind, there's been a ton of change in this program since Christmas, essentially, and we're not that far removed. Could I argue that the most important person that he got to, in this case, stay in the program is Bryce Underwood?
Well, certainly Michigan's got to build around the quarterback, and that was the direction of things a year ago when Michigan made a big play and offered a big deal to Bryce Underwood to get him to decommit from LSU and come play for his hometown school. I think it's an interesting question in terms of what's best for Michigan next season and long term, because the reality is Bryce Underwood was a below-average starting quarterback in the Big Ten this year. Now, he was an 18-year-old freshman who was thrown into the starting job probably before he was ready and still started every game, had some really nice moments where you saw his potential, also had some tough games, including his last game in the Citrus Bowl when he threw 3 interceptions. So would Michigan be better off next year with Bryce Underwood as a second-year starter or a guy out of the transfer portal? I think that's an interesting question that people could debate forever, but getting Bryce Underwood back does guarantee that Michigan has a guy they can build around. And I think Michigan put in the time and the development and the growing pains with Bryce Underwood this year as a freshman. So to me, it only makes sense to see that through and hope that with a new offensive coordinator and maybe an offense that's a little more suited to his strengths, that Bryce Underwood can make a big leap next year.
Rich Rodriguez was in Michigan 3 years. He was an outsider coming in, and there was a whole thought that he didn't negotiate the politics well, and he's got and maybe the politics couldn't be negotiated for an outsider, and he's got a very different personality than Kyle, so maybe that would be a major piece of the puzzle. But how hard is it for an outsider to come into Michigan?
Well, it is hard. I mean, and I'm speaking as an outsider who came into Michigan 7 years ago, having never set foot in Ann Arbor before, and had to learn this place for myself. It is hard. There is certainly a mystique around being a Michigan man that you pick up on the moment you get here. And that mystique was very strong for the last decade, starting when Jim Harbaugh came back here. But I also think if there is a time that somebody from the outside could come in here and be successful, it's right now, because the whole Jim Harbaugh era clearly had run its course. Promoting Sharon Moore was a way for Michigan to try to continue what Jim Harbaugh started, to be Jim Harbaugh's program basically without Jim Harbaugh, and we saw how that ended, right? It ended in disaster. It ended with Michigan needing somebody to come in and clean up the mess. And in that situation, I think you had to go outside. And so somebody like Kyle Whittingham, even though he's not from Michigan, he spent his whole career in Utah essentially, but I think his personality, just from what I've seen of it and his philosophy, I think it fits Michigan much better than Rich Rodriguez. With Rich Rod, it was not only that he was an outsider, but his whole philosophy was just so radically different from what Michigan had done in the past that I think it was just doomed. I don't think it's that way with Kyle Whittingham. It is going to be a transition for him, and I don't think it's a sure thing that it's going to work. But I do think that there's enough common ground with Kyle Whittingham in Michigan that at least he has a chance to succeed here.
My wife's family is from the Detroit area. My mother-in-law grew up there and all that. Still has plenty of relatives there. And several years ago, we were back there, and I told her I wanted to go through the Hitsville, the Motown thing there. And we got there, and the last tour started at 4 o'clock, and we got there about 4:10. And I went in, and I told the guy, I said, man, I'm from Utah, which I'm not from Utah, but I work here now. And so, we know the stereotypes of Utah. And I told the guy, I said, outside of Detroit, there's no bigger place that worships Motown than Salt Lake City. And she kind of looked at me and okay, you're putting me on here. But it was, I warmed up enough to her that she took me down some hallway and got my wife and I in the tour as it was ongoing, right? Which I really wanted to do. And the point I'm making is, when I said I'm from Utah, I might as well said I was from Pluto, and the way they think about Utah. They just don't know too many people from Utah. So not only is Whittingham and most of his staff going to be outsiders and not Michigan people, they're going to be from Utah. Now, does that raise an eyebrow, or is it among the fan base thinking, hey, this man has had a lot of success at Utah, so imagine what he can do with what's available at Michigan? Which one do you think it is?
I think it's a mix of both. I think right now the fan base is more on the side of what you just said, that look at this guy's track record. He's had success basically every year of his career, at Utah. Been one of the most consistent programs in college football over the last 2 decades. At a program that doesn't have the resources that Michigan has. So you bring that guy in here with Michigan's budget and NIL infrastructure. I think a lot of fans feel like that's a recipe for success. I think fans are excited about the staff. I think there's a little bit of ambivalence about some of the coaches that were let go, because the staff under Jim Harbaugh, he really made an emphasis on bringing some Michigan guys into the staff, guys who played at Michigan, coached at Michigan in the past. A lot of that's gone now. This is very much a kind of wholesale, a wholesale changeover from a very heavy Michigan influence to a very heavy Utah influence. I think some fans are, maybe a little bit in wait and see mode to see how that's going to play out. But I think on the whole, there's a sense that Kyle Whittingham has put together a really good staff and brought the best of the coaches that he worked with at Utah now to be part of his staff here at Michigan.
Michigan's coming off a 9-3, with the bowl loss, 9-4 season. That's pretty good. Obviously, it's not up to top shelf Michigan standards, but they probably have some pretty good players on the roster, but then I looked at the schedule, like they feasted on the bottom of the Big Ten. Not even the middle of the Big Ten. They struggled with Nebraska, and they lost to USC, but they feasted on the bottom of the Big Ten. The schedule looks a little tougher next year. Ohio State obviously is on the schedule, but so's Indiana, so's Oregon, and a non-conference game with Oklahoma. They lost in Norman this year. They'll have them at home coming up for Kyle here. What are the expectations are? How good is the talent on the roster? Because there's a long string of beating a bad Purdue team, beating a bad Maryland team, beating a bad Michigan State team, beating a bad Wisconsin team. How much do they really have on the roster?
At no point this year did I think Michigan looked like a playoff team, even though technically Michigan was alive for a playoff spot if they had beaten Ohio State. You're absolutely right that the 9-4 record was built on beating a lot of bad teams in the Big Ten. Wisconsin, Purdue, Michigan State, none of those teams had a Big Ten win when Michigan played them. So I think in some ways the record is a little bit empty when you look at who Michigan actually beat this year and how Michigan played against the best teams on the schedule. I do think there's talent on this roster. It wouldn't surprise me if Michigan is a playoff team next year, only because, I mean, we've talked about Bryce Underwood, but not just him. There are some talented young players on this team that it looks like Michigan is going to be in position to retain. The one thing that Sharon Moore did well, he recruited well the last couple of years. Michigan's 2025 recruiting class was very good. The 2026 class, which appears to be more or less intact, was very good. Headlined by Savion Hyder, top 10 prospect and number 1 running back in the class, who's going to stay and play for Tony Alford. Carter Meadows, a 5-star edge rusher in that 26 class as well. So there's talent on this team. A lot of it's young talent. I think what's going to determine whether Michigan is a playoff team next year will be, can they go in the portal and get some experienced guys to fill some gaps? Because a lot of their best players are young players. But there is talent in this program, and I think it's set up over the next 2 to 3 years for Kyle Whittingham to have success here.
I'm wondering also, too, the lack of the Michigan connection that the majority of the coaches will have. Excuse me. How much of that is a big deal in terms of recruiting with the idea that Michigan basically recruits nationally anyway?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know how much that stuff matters in this era of college football. You know, if this was 5-10 years ago, I think that would be a big talking point. But in this era, so much of it is about, do you have the infrastructure with NIL and revenue sharing and your personnel department to identify the right players? And if Michigan has that, I have high confidence that Kyle Whittingham is going to be able to coach the team. I think there's not many guys in college football you feel better about, just from a pure coaching standpoint. So it's really just about, does his personnel department and the NIL collective and all the people who have to work together to build the roster, does he have all that in place to get him the right players? And if he does, I think he'll be successful. And so much of it is just about having the money and figuring out who you want to spend it on. The connections, the Michigan ties, like that, maybe that has a little bit of influence, but in this day and age, I don't think it really matters that much. Your coach and your staff can come from anywhere. As long as you've got the right personnel people in place and the right infrastructure with NIL, you can build a really good roster.
How restricted is the football staff in bringing in recruits and bringing in transfers, given the fact that Michigan is a very good academic school? Does football get a lot of room to operate? I think we all know what I mean when I say that. Do they get a lot of room to operate, or is it maybe a little more restrictive than people on this side of the country would be aware of?
Michigan had a period of time early on with the transfer portal where they just were not very active in the portal at all. The first couple years of it, Michigan didn't take a lot of transfers. That part of that was just philosophically of how Jim Harbaugh wanted to build the team, and part of it was Michigan had to figure out which transfers to go after, which ones they could get in. I think one thing that Michigan learned the hard way early on is that the transfers you want at Michigan are going to be either grad transfers or guys who are pretty early in their careers. The transfers that are tough for Michigan are the guys who have, 2-3 years into their undergrad, but they haven't graduated, because a lot of their credits aren't going to transfer to Michigan, and guys don't want to come in and lose half their credits, have to start over on their undergrad degree. So you got to be a little bit selective at Michigan in terms of the transfers you go after. Not every guy in the portal is going to be a fit for Michigan, but I do think they've gotten to the point now where they can tell, okay, this guy's going to work for us, this guy isn't. I think they've got it down to the point that they can use the portal effectively and bring in guys who are going to be able to get eligible and enroll and ultimately help the team.
Obviously, with his age, he's not a long-term solution, being 66. Is there any apprehension of hiring a coach this age?
I think there is a bit. And I think that's one of the things that, maybe people aren't thinking about it right now. Right away, right? It's the honeymoon period. Everybody's excited. I think that's the overwhelming feeling here is excitement about Kyle Whittingham. But then, as time goes on, I think that's one of the things that is going to really define how we think about this era for Kyle Whittingham. Is he going to be here long enough to really put his stamp on the program, and what is that transition going to be like? Because it's going to be a question. I mean, my understanding is it's been a question at Utah for a while, right? Yeah. About when is he going to – how much longer does he want to coach? What's the transition going to look like? Who's going to replace him? If those questions were being asked at Utah over a period of several years, then I think it's a little naive to think that Kyle Whittingham's just going to coach 5 years at Michigan and it's not going to come up. I think it's going to come up, and a lot of it's going to depend on, is he successful right away? If he comes out and makes the playoff in year one, I think everybody's going to be happy to let it ride. But if it's not everything that Michigan hopes it can be, then is there going to be a question a few years in of, okay, well, what's the transition going to look like here? I think it's a legitimate question that's going to come up sooner or later, and we'll just have to see how soon that becomes an issue here.
How does the top of the Big Ten stack up? Where does Michigan fit? And you've said it a couple times now. It sounds like 10-2 in a playoff bid, everyone's going to declare victory in 2026.
Yeah, if Kyle Whittingham gets Michigan in the college football playoff next year, I think everybody's going to feel good about how all of this played out. Even if it was traumatic to get to this point, if it ends up with Kyle Whittingham as the coach of Michigan and Michigan in the playoff, I think fans will feel like, hey, we came out of this better than we were going in. One of the challenges for Michigan is that they have fallen out of that top tier in the Big Ten now. I mean, I think they're in the second tier of Big Ten teams, but I'm not sure I'd even put Michigan at the top of that tier. Michigan played USC this year and got blown out at the Coliseum, and that was a decent USC team, but not a great USC team. Michigan got beaten pretty soundly by Illinois last year. So clearly Indiana, Ohio State, Oregon, those teams are on a different level from Michigan. And Michigan's going to play those teams next year, as you mentioned. And if that gap is still as wide as it was this year, then it's going to be tough for Kyle Whittingham to get Michigan in the playoff next year, just because the schedule is so much tougher. But I think Michigan's, they're knocking on the door. They're in that second tier of the Big Ten, but the top of the Big Ten is really strong, and it's not going to be easy for Michigan to make that step up into that top group.
What's the status of the university president and athletic director, the people who signed off on hiring him?
Well, Michigan's going to have a new university president. The president they have now is an interim president who's been there for several months. The new president is, as I understand it, going to be announced early this year. And there is an ongoing investigation of the athletic department culture and practices that came out of everything that happened with Sharon Moore. The investigation started as a third-party investigation of Sharon Moore's relationship with a female staff member. And then when it came out that he was, in fact, engaged in that relationship, the investigation then expanded to look at the whole athletic department, which has had, beyond this situation, a bunch of other scandals, including the sign stealing thing with Connor Stallions, 2 different NCAA investigations, and that's just in football. They've had issues in other programs too. So that's raised some questions about the future of Ward Manuel, the athletic director here. He's been at Michigan for a decade. He played at Michigan. Michigan's programs have generally been successful during Ward Manuel's tenure, but they've had a lot of off the field issues. So I don't honestly know where that's going to go. There's always stuff bubbling up at Michigan. There's always been talk for as long as I've been here of, what's Ward Manuel's future, and he always seems to come out of that still in the chair. There's some thought that maybe this time it'll be different, but I don't know. I think that's going to be a question. Maybe one reason you mentioned Kyle Whittingham's age. If Kyle Whittingham was in his 30s and wanting to coach 2 decades at Michigan, I think the instability with the athletic director and the administration would probably be a concern. Maybe not quite as much for a coach in Kyle Whittingham's position.
The most scathing summary I heard of this was that Michigan likes to pretend it's all that and that they're different and they're high and they're mighty. But look at all the scandals in Michigan the last 5 years. They are basically the SEC no matter what they say. Man, I would think that kind of thing lands pretty poorly in Ann Arbor, bodes pretty well for a complete outsider coming in, because my perception from a long way away is that Michigan people would hate hearing that, and yet there isn't a lot they can say right now when they do hear that.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody can deny that over the last 5 years, Michigan has been one of the most dysfunctional football programs in the country in terms of the off-the-field stuff. Biff Poggi, the interim coach at Michigan, said as much before the Citrus Bowl that he called it a malfunctioning organization. Now, somehow Michigan managed to win a national championship amid all of that, which is still kind of mind-blowing to me. But just the sheer number of off-field scandals that have happened at Michigan over the last 5 years has got to rank up there with any program in college football, maybe at the top. And that is, I think, a blow to the self-image of Michigan as the leaders and the best, the program that sets the standard in college football. I mean, you hear a lot of that stuff around here. I do think that Michigan fans care about that. I think, they do care about how the program is perceived. And I think that's part of why they're excited about Kyle Whittingham, is because, as we said earlier, he does bring that reputation as a guy who, runs the program with integrity, runs a clean program, a tough program, a program that fans can identify with. They're really ready for that after all of the scandals that have happened over the last few years.
Well, has it finally happened, Austin? Has Kyle Whittingham been contacted by Tom Brady?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I know Tom's got some stuff going on right now. Tom's got another coaching search he's got to worry about in Vegas. So I don't know if they've had time to talk. I mean, Tom, he stayed connected to the program. He was a big part of Bryce Underwood signing with Michigan. So I'm going to assume that if that conversation hasn't happened yet, that it will happen in the near future. But I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
Tom Brady's got an owner to get under control. There's one constant in a couple decades of chaos, and it's a guy with a pretty special. Yeah, right. There's one constant. That's a guy with a bowl haircut, and I think he's causing some problems. Managing up is a problem for everyone, including, it turns out, Tom Brady. So there's that. Austin, we appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for filling us in on Michigan football.
All right, guys. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Austin Meek, Michigan writer for The Athletic. Not on the top tier. Yeah, that's fair analysis. Those other teams with back-to-back playoff appearances. Iowa State with the title. Indiana's in the semifinal still playing. Oregon, another Big Ten team.
Yeah, but I don't think you look at Michigan on a yearly basis, though. You look at
They're still Michigan. They can get back.
The 30,000 perspective. And there's few programs that are like Michigan.
Fact.
Yeah.
Well, the expectation will be to get back sooner, not later.
In 2026?
Yeah. Yep.
And then in 2027. It's what Kyle said. You come here, you're expected to compete for that national title every single year.
DJ and PK, when we come back, we'll give away tickets to see the Jazz and the Hornets Saturday at the Delta Center. Everything you missed in this show coming up next. Stay with us.